is as opposed to what it's not. The real issue, I think, for us as a board is it's one thing to talk about what other people have done, and that's potentially an interesting place to start. But what has worked? You know, what is, it's more than just what others do. It's how you use a practice to solve a problem. And with perpetual problems of density to availability of seats, and ongoing issues related to an $800 million backlog, I'm not sure that what's been given, well, it's not that I'm not sure. I know that what has been given to us doesn't get us there. And that's really the big issue is how do we begin to proactively solve problems? How do we get ahead of this curve? I said before, you know, the thing that keeps me up is the fact that we're so behind, that we're so disproportionate in our capital dollars from the Board of Supervisors and the disproportionality of the distribution to facility space. I'm not sure what you're suggesting from this, and I'll let you come in at the end. But the reality is, can we go to slide J, the one that has J? The reality is this is existing practice, and Dr. Brabrand, you have the purview over administrative boundaries, period. That's your wheelhouse, and the way it's set forth is the school board does the standard and expedited boundary approval. And the concern I have at this point in existing practice today is that the administrative boundaries have ground to a halt. The trains have stopped. And the reason I bring this up in terms of the analysis question, and this is no surprise because I'm always asking about the data in context, is, for example, you know, if split feeders are a concern for us, and you know where we're prioritizing, it's the impact at the ground level. You know, it's the impact to an individual family, to an individual student, how that correlates to student achievement, how that has to do with best practices from peeling children from their cohorts, what that has to do with mental health and wellness. And of our elementary split feeders, for example, only 7 have a worse than 90-10 split. 10% of a student population is bound for a different boundary. Only 7 elementary schools. To me, that kind of analysis is what's missing here. That's what we should be looking at. Of the elementaries that do have a split feeder, 20 for just the 6th grade cohort have worse than a 70-30 split. So imagine if you have, you know, 3 or 4 6th grades, there's 100 kids, 84 kids going to one school and 16 being peeled off to another. That is a substantial impact to a family, to a student, to their ability to integrate into their next school. And so we're talking a lot about equity, but this is what concerns me because I don't know what the suggestion is. Is the suggestion that we're going to decide that staff is going to recommend where children go based on the color of their skin or the size of their parents' bank account? Because I don't know how we're going to do that. I don't know what the legal hurdles are to that. I don't know what the best practice is, that's even a good idea, is to decide, well, you're this color, or your parents are in this zip code, or you're in this neighborhood, and we're going to decide where you go based on where your house is, and you don't get to go to your neighborhood school anymore. I mean, we're talking about reverse engineering busing or something. So this conversation sort of a little bit makes me nervous because I don't see where we're going. I just see, well, here's what other people do. And what is that, how does that correlate to where the pressures are? Like Janie brought up, you know, you've got some, heavy building in a certain corridor, and that creates pressures for space for the foreseeable future. And it takes, and the cycle to acquire bond money from the Board of Supervisors, acquire it maybe proportionately to our needs versus their needs, and then do the build. I mean, that's a life cycle that's long. And so looking for the alternate means to provide, what I've said is the right space in the right place. Do we need elementary space in a certain area? Do we need high school space in a certain area? What are the pressures that are coming to bear with the closure of Paul VI High School? What do the growth patterns look like, not as a division, but in certain areas? And if Ms. Corbett Sanders brought up, if you've got concentrations of population growth in certain areas, that's one aspect of pressure on schools, but another is neighborhood turnover. I just got a concern from a West Springfield community parent that said that they were just told that as soon as the renovations are finished on West Springfield High School, we're actually going to be past capacity, and we're talking about bringing back trailers after getting rid of Sparta. I don't know that that's true, and I don't really want to go down the rabbit hole, but I'm just saying that turnover of neighborhoods increases pressure on schools when you have older communities that all of a sudden start producing the younger children, and you don't need new buildings to put the pressure on the schools. Like, there are a lot of different factors. So looking at, it's the what. What's next from this? What is your anticipated, as staff, your next thought on what happens after this? Because I don't know what that is, and I'm looking to you to tell us. So can you give us, you can sort of do a sweeping, there was a lot there, I understand.
I don't mind starting it and then letting them fill in. I definitely understand the board's point about wanting to look at us bringing forth recommendations. There's been some discussion among the board whether to do that with a thought partner, with a consultant to help move forward. There are a few board members saying, well, this is the way we've always done it. There's multiple decisions this board can make. One is we're going to do it the same way that we've done it. And here's what we've done. We have a lot of factors. There's no priority. And the board of the moment decides based on all of those factors together. The other is either with or without a consultant, we can take what we've learned from looking at these prevailing practices and come up with what we think are the best recommendations with or without a consultant. And we'd be glad to do that. Being transparent and honest is what it's about. These are big decisions. They have been, always will be in Fairfax County. It's my second year with you. We have a lot of boundary issues that are coming into play, and I just want to, good leaders define reality and offer hope. We need to define reality for what our current boundary policy and practices are, and offer hope, and maybe more than hope, clarity to the community on what we're going to do going forward. Are we going to use the format we've used over the last several years? Are we going to come up with a more defined format and then explain it to the community so as we make decisions, the rationale is there? And we can do that on our own or with a thought partner to the degree that the board feels. But that's where my head is, and we need to do it with deliberate speed. I'm not talking about years and years from now. We need to decide something. Frankly, I would like to have something decided by the end of this school year so that we can begin making decisions moving forward into next year and the year after.
So I'm glad you brought up the defining the issue, because I actually think that's another thing that's missing here. This is what everybody else is doing versus what we're doing. But what is it that we need to solve? And I think that's the priority question of And I've pointed out in the past that, for example, the Prince William CIP really boldly states, this is telling you what we're going to do this coming year, and everything after that is a plan. Like, everything after that is subject to change. It's just scoped out as what potentially could happen because things intervene. And, when Janie says that, she's expecting major boundary changes in her area, that gives me pause, because I don't know that we've decided that. And I don't know that a major boundary change is the only way to solve problems. I think boundary changes are the most disruptive. They're the most disruptive and costly to the system, and they're the most disruptive to families in the community. And so solving and identifying the issue that we're trying to solve and solving them in alternate paths other than major boundaries changes, I think should be our goal. It should be through program placement and capacity utilization questions, and do we need to have, for example, in order to take some of the pressures off of one school at a high school level, should we be pursuing a governor's school for the liberal arts? Should we be looking at other innovative ways to draw people to where we need them to be, so that we get and place people where we need to in the least disruptive option available to us? And so, defining the issue is, where's the problem first, and then having the discussion with the board about how we handle that. And I don't know, Kevin or Jessica or Marty, if you want to.
I think you already actually described the CIP. I mean, I don't, when we're trying to solve everything right now through the capital program. As I said, I can't rely solely on boundary changes. Even if I thought there was one that made sense from any number of these factors, depending on the school and the community, it's almost impossible to do. I think so. That's what that's the best that I can do. I worry about these schools. They start to get, it's really, really crowded. So we have a number of them that are in that state. That's why I have an addition shown there, Justice or West Potomac. We can see Madison is not quite there, but they are moving rapidly there. I have probably McLean High School is the next on the list, and these are older, some of these are older, small campuses. I don't know what to do.
But in those situations, though, even if a boundary change just shifts the problem for a temporary period of time, because then we wind up with, I hate to bring up a sore point, but you wind up with an Annandale issue, a Woodson Annandale issue, where we thought we solved a problem, and instead we just we delayed it, but then exacerbated the problem in a different place.
Well, that's 100% accurate. I don't know. Wasn't involved in that particular decision. And that's the best example to show of where the staff wasn't able to perform the appropriate analysis, and it created an issue at Woodson, no doubt.
Well, I have another really good example for you. No, Clifton Elementary. I have, other schools that now have trailers and overcrowded classrooms and everything else as a result. But so the question is, what do you want us, what is your suggestion to us? I mean, we can give you next steps, but it's almost as if we need a next step from staff on, okay, so now we've had this discussion, now what?
That's a good question. There's a couple things. One, we have a number of what we would consider administrative changes, just simple lot line adjustments, things of that nature. For example, is it Lee District? Yeah, Island Creek. There's a new townhomes being developed there, and the street of the townhomes is divided between Hayfield Elementary and Island Creek. So we would suggest that these simple adjustments for lot lines, we have a couple cases where a street was extended, it was a cul-de-sac, and then they built at the end, and now the new section actually falls in a different boundary. So we're sending two buses up the same street for two separate schools. So simple things like that.
So, Ms. Corbett, this is the kind of thing, as opposed to a building increasing our carbon footprint, the whole issue of transportation and split feeders is improving, transportation and reducing transportation times for students also takes care of that concern that you brought up.
Right, you're correct. I mean, there's a lot of things. Sometimes, you know, all of us know that not all the boundaries today are logical. I mean, I hear about legacy boundaries, which I appreciate. You know, whatever happened 50 years ago, but at some point we have to move past that because we have inefficiencies in the system. You know, I know from a pure facilities perspective, you know, we can see what's happening. Janie referred to it, which was the pressure of the Silver Line and the western end of the county. And the fact that we don't have affordable land. I mean, I'm not going to find 65 acres anywhere unless it would cost, you know, entire 1 year of the capital program. I mean, that literally is what it would be. So there's no, you know, affordable or available land. And we're really projecting long term. We think that as the county becomes more populated, that transportation, some of the transportation routes that we currently have are not going to be feasible. I mean, we already have through a number of programs, kids that are on, you know, buses for an extended length of time. I mean, if you ask me, I would tell you to set a maximum bus ride. We should look at communities. I mean, you know, all of the things that we discuss. And just from a staff perspective, it'd been nice to know, have some parameters, what the priorities are. So frequently, we're not exactly sure when we're looking at a problem just because it's based on the community and the areas where that's affected. I'm not being critical, it's just the reality of it. So long term, we know we have to address this, but some of those priorities, I think, should be the anchor of whatever the policy and the regulation are. And the consistency is, to me, when we were talking to the communities, if we were saying, at least from these perspectives, that we have treated everybody equally, that's how we evaluate it. That would be one of my suggestions.
So, Dr. Brabrand, I don't know if you have a thought on that, because that's the other difference between these other school jurisdictions and Fairfax County. You know, we're the home to the worst traffic in the United States of America. So if another jurisdiction, you know, has a priority on transportation or not, it's not comparable to, I mean, our transportation issues are so much worse. So, you know, I mean, I've heard a couple of next steps, and I don't know if staff wants to bring those up. So to be prepared, I don't know if you're going to reference the slide, but as Ms. McLaughlin completes her go back, if you would be thinking about what your ask is of us, because I think we lack clarity on what we do next.
I can help a little. The board can say, leave it as it is, we're comfortable as it is, and continue to move forward. The board can say, finish the work, bring your best recommendations with or without a thought partner. We can do that. Or the board can, with what it has now, says these are factors based on the values we've already developed in the strategic plan that we want you to prioritize going forward. So we can leave the policy as it is. The board can offer clarity based on its own review of what we've done so far, or we can develop recommendations with or without a thought partner to bring to the board.
Okay, Ms. McLaughlin.
So this is helpful following you, Ms. Schultz. The reason I wanted to go back is because the question was, are there best practices related to boundaries? And, you know, can we even find the best practice? I do think that we can find the optimal practices, and to the point I made earlier, which is based on educational research. So in my time on the board, I've certainly learned about things like tipping points in schools. You know, the socio-economic demographics in a school. It's very real. There's lots of educational research on it, and that is a significant factor when you're deciding on boundary changes. So that's what I meant earlier when I said the data chart is a good first look, but the analysis piece is you and your leadership team, which I don't actually think we need a consultant. I worry about that being too much of a delay. As Mr. Sneed commented during the break, I mean, I've got administrative boundary issues with split feeders and islands that are very small. They're not helpful to children and families at all, and they're just stuck. I mean, I don't know if you all realize this. We haven't done any boundary changes in recent memory. Everything's just stuck, and we can't, as a school division of this size with capacity challenges, we'll just stay stuck. So, but I also want to point out things like we know the psychological impact on foster care children, on our unaccompanied minors, on homeless children, that instability and frequent changing of schools is harmful. That's what I meant by the educational research. You all can say there's 9, 11 different factors when you decide a boundary, but the psychological, social, emotional impact on children, this is why this factor has to be a priority. Ms. Schultz was talking about traffic. Traffic is a massive issue here. So we have to be mindful. No child benefits, and this county doesn't benefit with kids being on long bus rides and compounding the traffic issue. We also know that families want the stability. They either will stay in our schools if they feel that there's boundary attendance stability, or they're not, as I referenced Wake County. So to Mr. Moon's point, I do think that absolutely there's the educational research that should frame the guidelines and recommendations that you would bring to us. If any report or study of any kind was drafted on this and not brought to the board, then revise it, refine it, and bring it to the board. Because it's my understanding that staff did a lot of work on this, but we ended up seeing a chart. So whatever staff did in all this material, bring that with the recommendations. That's when our conversation happens. You bring the research to it, and then we discuss it, bringing the community voice to it. And then we also bring it back out to the community. But
All right,
I
I've
know.
got two very quick go backs, and then we have to get to next steps because I'm keeping this train on. So, Ms. Evans and Ms. Corbett Sanders.
Thank you. And I appreciate following Ms. McLaughlin. I do very much agree with what you've said. And thank you, Ms. Schultz, for bringing up the Annandale High School. There's a cautionary tale in that, and that's a good example of how boundary changes did change socioeconomics. And I will say every board member who was on the board then and currently voted against doing that, but we were outvoted. So that I do think we need to keep that as a cautionary tale in considering what we do. I did have a question. I'll make one quick note about split feeders. I have a split feeder that I think, in fact, I'm sure is more than a 1090 split, but the people.
I have the data analysis. I can give it to you.
Well, no, that's fine, but I'm only making a simple point here that when we went back to those folks and asked them if they wanted to change, they've decided they're okay. So, there are some people who are okay with that. One example that, and I have a larger question to ask here that hasn't been raised. I have an elementary school where they actually want a boundary change because they feel that they're, for a number of reasons, they feel that their elementary school is too large. And we had a community meeting with them. Mr. Sneed was there. Ms. Gillis was there. So thank you for that conversation. This is Glen Forest. They actually came to us and asked for it. And we're looking at, when we look at the possibility of a fairly simple change, I think the conversation has headed in the direction of, well, maybe it needs to be broader. Maybe we need to include more schools. And that gives me some concern when I think about a boundary change that could be, it doesn't really qualify as administrative because there are too many kids, but I don't think it qualifies as expedited either. So I guess I would ask you about a situation like that where we have some solutions that could be relatively simple and relatively quick. Does our policy require us to go big?
So, well, one of this really what you're asking is, most of the time we would do one semester you would have a scoping meeting, just using this as an example, the following, it takes about then the following semester, you would have the actual boundary study and then the board would vote on it. The real question that you're asking is about the phasing, meaning the moment that the boundary change is adopted by the board, could you the following fall have the kids at the new facility? Which is I don't know that the policy dictates the timing. And so this is one of the things that Jessica was kind of pointing out in the practices here. We don't address that. So yes, the fact is you could do that if you wanted to, but a lot of times we'll give them 1 or 2 years.
But what the practice showed is that other jurisdictions, there's nobody else that really phases. We're
Correct.
really the only one. Other ones, when they do the boundary change, it changes.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is I think we may be missing the boat on something that might allow us to be slightly more nimble if we have just 2 adjacent schools where it's fairly simple. I think
this is the bigger discussion of the
This is
what's
the
It is,
of what-
and
of
so-
what's next. So I don't want us to go down this rabbit hole because really the decision is we have to decide what to do next.
And so but I wanted to raise this because I think that's something that we have to discuss. If something like this doesn't qualify as either administrative, expedited, or standard, we should be thinking about how to be more nimble in that way if it makes sense to do it.
Ms. Corbett Sanders, last one.
Yes, and actually, I'm glad you raised that because one of the things that would be helpful to know is whether or not we need to have a differentiation in approaches based on an elementary school boundary change within a pyramid versus middle and high school where you are impacting where kids end up in the high school. Because I think there's a bit more concerns when kids are starting to move between middle and high schools. And so the reason I raise that is it brings me back to the conversation that started with Mr. Moon about what we really need to do is establish the goals. What are our policy goals? And I encourage all of my board colleagues not to look at this in isolation, that our boundary discussion has to be looked at from an equity lens and from the lens of one Fairfax. And so when we look at our goals, we should be looking at what is good for one Fairfax, because too often, if we only look at neighboring schools because of the historic decisions that have been made, then we're just reinforcing some of the historic decisions that were not healthful
What
for
does
our
that mean
community.
in practice, Ms. Corbett Sanders?
Well, I think what that means is that we set, and I will be willing to work with Mr. Moon, Dr. Brabrand, and our clerk to set a session on the goals that we should be trying to achieve as part of our boundary policy. And then based on those goals, which I don't think, we could use input from Dr. Brabrand and his staff as to what are goals that can help us be more effective in our boundary discussion. But then based on an agreement on those goals, then we look to staff to come back to us with.
Really what you're talking about is the next step. One of the next steps out of this is we need a successive work session after staff does the analysis. Because
Well-
it's where are we going? And
But I'm not sure staff can fully do the analysis unless they get direction from us, which is. Ms. McLaughlin, would you like to speak before me? You're welcome to. What I think we need to do is have a discussion amongst ourselves as to what our priorities are. And our priorities have been established as a board and with the county under one Fairfax. And that's a priority, but how does that priority inform the goal setting for boundary adjustments? Or are we going to say, as a board, it doesn't inform it? But we have to have that conversation. And so I would suggest that we probably will end up with 2 additional work sessions on boundaries at a minimum. The first work session is an agreement on goal setting amongst ourselves as the board. And then the second one is based on those goals, what do we have to do to address, and it's probably Section E of this matrix on whether or not we need to weight those criteria. And I leave it up to staff as to decide whether we need an external consultant or not to do that piece.
So that added another layer, and I think it's only fair, obviously Ms. McLaughlin has something to say on that.
So Ms. Corbett-Sanders, I'm sorry for the reaction, but what's concerning to me is from the very beginning, what we've talked about in this work session is we need staff to provide us with objective educational research on these factors. As a board, we cannot set our goals and priorities if we're not informed on educational best practice on how these factors impact children and learning. Once we do that, then absolutely, as someone who helped champion One Fairfax and helped develop One Fairfax, we want that to be a guidepost. But we first have to understand the impact that these different factors have on children and families, and that comes from staff looking at the research and doing the analysis. So my reaction is that it's already difficult today that we don't have any analysis and any research to inform us on where we are. So it worries me when you were describing that we're going to have another goal-setting conversation. It would be a goal-setting with our individual opinions, not on research informing our opinions on boundaries. So I still think the analysis has got to happen first before we have an opinion.
I did not say that we would do it in a vacuum.
okay,
We did
hold on.
ask for
Hold
input
on.
from staff.
Hold on.
And so,
Hold on,
Well-
I'm gonna allow this absolute last comment, and then I want next steps up. Mr. Moon.
Actually, this is the next step, based upon what I have heard from other board members. So
Staff, can we bring up next steps, please? Go ahead.
I want to propose the next step. Schedule a follow-up work session where a staff will bring a research from, if they can find the research out there. I mean, I don't want to necessarily ask, staff to, hire a consultant, because we don't know how much that's going to cost, what the time frame that's going to be. So, as much as possible without having to hire a consultant, bring back existing research out there so that that could guide us in setting goals that the board wants to achieve through a boundary adjustment or boundary changes, that based upon that future work sessions discussion, that might help us guide reviewing our existing policies, whether we add more factors or eliminate some of the factors or prioritize amongst those factors. So it would require some successive work sessions, but first step being bring something that would help us guide. Because the last time we did this was, as I recall, is probably 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago.
so Mr. Moon, can you look at that last bullet?
Okay, we'll get to it. So I agree. I think that's what I was proposing is that we have a work session where the analysis comes back, and then if we're going to have a successive work session about goals, but I do agree with Il-Young and Megan that we need to have some of this analysis done. So if we can start from the top, analyze data presented and report back. I think that was almost a universal. Is anybody opposed to that?
But Ms. Schultz, it needs to include, it's not just analyze the data presented, but provide the educational research.
Can you add including educational research, please?
Surrounding the factors impacting boundary decisions. I don't know if we need the clarity that it's the existing factors we have, whatever the 16, is that what I saw? Yeah,
Okay, and then,
16 factors.
and so is there anybody that is opposed to that? I think almost everybody universally spoke to that. Okay, change the title from
Yeah.
national study.
I think, as Dr. Brabrand said, it should be prevailing practices. Some,
A survey,
yeah,
a survey.
yeah, to
to
survey of prevailing practices around school boundaries.
Can I get a nodding consensus? Yes, yes, okay. Add totals to all the columns in the boundary adjustment matrix. That should be easy for staff, correct? Adding totals, yes, yes. Prioritize factors, possibly hire consultant to identify how prioritization. Now, this is talking about hiring a consultant. I'm going to take an actual vote on this because that adds another layer and more time.
Sorry, didn't
So
we
do-
say
can we-
staff let us know if you feel that you need a consultant or not? I don't. Right, I don't really want to vote on whether or not we should. I think we said can staff decide whether or not this can be done internally or we do need a
So
consultant?
the prioritizing the factors, how is that going to be different than the first bullet? Okay, but do you feel, Ms. Corbett Sanders, that it's reflected in the first bullet now?
I think that no, hers.
I'm asking Ms. Corbett Sanders.
I don't think it's the same thing, because the first bullet is primary research of what's been done to date. The second bullet is digging down beyond what's been done to date to determine how it should inform our process going forward. And that's also why the predictability in discussion, so those two together of Ms. Palachuk's. And so I would suggest that if you want to combine them into a
Does the bullet read like you want it to read? And because we're going to vote on this one,
why are we voting on this one and not the others?
because the others were reflected through everyone's conversation. This didn't necessarily come up in everyone's conversation.
Ms. Schultz, I think it actually, as Dr. Brabrand said, it was bringing recommendations, right? Bringing recommendations about prioritizing factors. So
I would
I would
suggest-
think it is, we do need your bullet.
Yeah,
But I
we
would say,
need
but
it.
it needs to reflect recommendations. We're wanting staff to bring a recommendation on how to prioritize these factors.
That's what changes this bullet. If we add before this, bring recommendations to prioritize factors and possibly hire a consultant, then that puts on the staff bringing back a recommendation to us. That changes the bullet, I think.
I don't think so, but I don't really care. I'm
And
not
what
going to.
I also want to say that until we change our practices again, currently for our next steps, we are not taking votes. We are clarifying with the person who made it we may change this if it reflects what they're saying. So we either stick to that
We're
practice or
consistent
not.
across all, but I am perfectly fine the way it is. I think it captures, when I say possibly hire a consultant, that means that staff is perfectly capable of figuring out how to best organize their work. And what I'm looking for is to identify how prioritization process should be addressed going forward. That's the same thing as bringing recommendations in my mind, but if you want to edit it, you're welcome to edit it.
Mr. Moon, do you want to say something on this bullet?
Yeah, that's really, yes. As a person who's strongly supporting last bullet, because that is very close to what I said, and I consider that to be the most important next step as far as I am concerned. I think, voting on that particular bullet you just mentioned up there is a little too premature, because we need to do the next work session before we get to that point.
Correct.
So we don't want to ask a staff to do the work without us having that discussion. So that's premature. Because I'm not prepared to say today, right here, to say we need to prioritize all those factors in any fashion.
But are you asking for those recommendations to be brought as part of the next work session?
Not at the next one, perhaps based upon what our goals may be at the following, not right away, because I don't want them to do the work prior to we do the next step.
Ms. McLaughlin?
So my concern, and why I'd wanted it in my first bullet, and Dr. Brabrand said they would do it, is that if they don't bring their subject matter expertise as educators on the educational research, then who are we to talk about this in a vacuum for prioritizing? I need to know their subject matter expertise first.
Which is precisely why my concept was first hearing from their subject matter experts, either in-house or bringing in external resources. I really don't care how they organize their work, but bringing those recommendations, and that should inform our goal-setting process. So if you look, that's where the prioritization request came from, and then to summarize by having a work session on that goal-setting process. But I agree with Mr. Moon that the goal-setting is the responsibility of this board. It is not the responsibility of staff. But to inform that goal-setting, we need to have their best work coming to us.
Correct. So I'm actually in agreement with you, but I did not hear Mr. Moon saying he wants their recommendations. And I'm saying before the next work session on this, if we don't have their subject matter expertise and
folks,
recommendations, then
we need to-
it's, the goal setting's done in a
If
vacuum.
you, Mr. Moon, if you want me to, I can move your bullet up before this, and
Yes,
we can vote
please.
on that.
Yes, please.
Can we move the last bullet
I-
up before this, please? I think that will,
Mr. Schultz, could I just briefly,
Yes.
if, for example, and hypothetically, if the board says that, board decides upon our goals to achieve, fiscal responsibility is the highest importance. And then we'll look at proximity to achieve nothing else. Hypothetically, let's say those are the two goals, and we don't care about other things at all. Then other factors in the policy may be moot. So that is why we need to set our goals first before we direct the staff to spend their time to look at all these factors and see whether they can come up with the priorities and recommendations. That was my point. We gotta do our work first so that they can do the follow-up work.
I agree with Mr. Moon. So if we could schedule 2 additional work sessions, one where the staff will bring existing research to guide the board and set goals for boundary policy, the other on addressing criteria. That's Mr. Moon's? Okay.
Mr. Moon added
Does that-
to it, so we're
Ms.
happy to join.
Doesn't matter, my name doesn't have to be added.
Does this read as you desire it?
When you say criteria, are you talking prioritization or priorities?
Factors.
Factors in E.
Okay, factors.
Okay, can we vote on scheduling 2 additional work sessions? Okay, that has consensus. Then bring recommendations to prioritize factors as listed out in this bullet. Ms. Corbett-Sanders, are you suggesting that that be a part of the additional work sessions we've just described?
Well, now that we've restructured it a little, I would suggest that the recommendations to prioritize factors taking into account the goals that have been established by the board. And so what we may end up as a result of that is the staff may say, well, there are only 2 goals and they're equally weighted, or there are 6 goals and the first 2 are 35% and the,
I understand.
whatever.
Does this read as you wish? Okay, can I get a vote on this, please? This is on the bring recommendations to prioritize factors, taking into account goals established by the board, possibly hire a consultant. All those in favor? 1, 2, 3, 4. I only have 4.
So with my sub point, I guess what I'm trying to get is, it seems a little bit like the next phase. So first we come up with the policy and the criteria, and then once we prioritize, and where I was talking about predictability is, then at some point we have to talk about the process of getting there, the phasing out of our current system, and what we will do moving forward, because we're hopefully not just going to implement it overnight.
So an implementation.
Or an implementation
Okay,
plan.
but I asked for a vote, and there were 4 votes out of 9.
Well, Ms. Schultz, I have a question about this. So I think the vote was premature. Isn't the second half of that sentence redundant now?
That's the point I was trying to make.
I mean,
No,
isn't
the second half,
how does that change what the first half says?
so the first half is bring recommendations to prioritize. So they bring their recommendations based on our goals, And
we
then
just,
we
can we
either,
just split this into two? Maybe that would make it easier
can
for
I just,
everybody. Okay.
hold on a second.
I'm just a suggestion to get us to advance, because we're 30 minutes behind, and I want us to be able to vote. And maybe if they're combined, that's too hard for everyone to vote on.
Well, and the second question is, I'm sorry, but I don't really understand how Ms. Palchek's, what that is. I'm not sure what that is. So, but let me ask.
So what we're trying to
Ms.
do in this
Pierce
bullet
first.
is if you have 2 additional work sessions above,
Right,
the first one is the goal setting.
right.
And then the second one is addressing criteria, or I would say factors. So the next bullet is based on the first work session and the goal setting. Now we need to inform our prioritization of the factors that we're going to use. And so is it, are all equally weighted as they are today supposedly? Or is there a need to say that these 3 goals are, category 1 goals?
The reason I'm saying this is premature, because really what we're doing is we're creating a next step for a future work session. And I think it's best that this become a next step out of the successive work session, because we're trying to leapfrog ahead. And I think that's why I'm seeing a little bit of difficulty of people trying to get a hold of it, because it's going to be predicated on a future conversation.
And I guess what I'm looking at is trying to address Ms. Palchik's concerns about having a plan in place so that our communities understand the process going forward. And what we're doing now, if we only focus on the goal setting, is we're leaving our community out there kind of
But
holding.
predictability could be a goal. Predictability could be one of the goals that we establish, is that we need to have predictability, and so that would pardon the bad pun.
Bind.
That would control future boundary discussions and tying it to the need to be predictable for families.
So I don't know why mine was put as a sub-bullet. So that's why I was trying to speak to it, and I kind of want to separate that. I mentioned 3 things here. That's fine. I don't want us to tell staff which factors should be included. We're going to have that conversation next. But I do think it's important. I think what Ms. Corbett-Sanders is getting at is that once we're having this conversation, and if we're saying we want by the end of the school year to have a plan, that should include a timeline. That should include, we're not next year going to redo every single one of our boundaries to match these factors. So I guess at some point, quickly, we also need to figure out what the phasing plan is for this new plan. So it's a little, right, the priorities, I gave a few factors. This was just one of them. I hope they get included when we have the conversation. But then at some point, I will have heartburn if we have this conversation and at the end of this year, we say, we have a new plan and we have no idea what the next steps are.
I want to be
That's
responsive
all.
to both of you, because these are somehow your bullets. If they need to read differently, then tell us how they need to read so that we can vote on them and move on.
It's fine. I guess I'm trying to get clarity on if we're going to talk about what they say and then vote on them, which has not been our practice, but if we're changing that, okay, let's just be consistent. Then I know Scott wants to say something. I don't need predictability to be there. I want to say that we need a timeline. Yes, so that's okay. Predictability is one of several factors. It doesn't have to be there. I'm happy to erase that one as long as we have a timeline.
Is it possible to parking lot these for our successive work session?
I'd like to hear from Scott, if that's okay. Thank you.
You could simply say, ask staff to develop timeline for any changes in the boundary process that the board determines, so that we're telling the community what, I think that's what I heard you saying, is when would we be making the changes if we were
Right.
developing new goals, new criteria, what would be the timeline for
Well,
the
and I have
implementation
several
of those?
boundaries. I have had boundary changes recently, and there are some that are kind of holding on this process. So immediately, it would be helpful to get some more clarity as to what this means for our process immediately and then moving forward.
And I think that addresses much of what I was trying to capture, which is we've got to have a process in place. And so it's more than just a timeline. It's ask staff to develop a proposal for the process and timeline for any boundary changes, for changes to the boundary process. Does that make sense? Okay, so are we voting? And if you want to do, so the bullet above, which seemed to have caused some consternation for some, if we need recommendations to prioritize the factors, taking into account goals that have been established by the board. So that's really, what are we doing? Why are we doing the goal setting? It's so that we can then address the prioritization. So it's trying to, and maybe this informs your process. If you want to get rid of it and just staff understand that that's what we're trying to do, is inform your process, then I'm fine with that. But, huh? I wouldn't get rid of it. Well, according to me, I mean, apparently.
We need to keep it, and let staff use this as a framework as they're gonna bring whatever work it is to us. I wouldn't get rid of it.
Well, I think this.
Ms. Keys-Gamarra.
Well, I was a little unclear. I'm very comfortable with the first part of that, bring recommendations to prioritize factors taking into account goals that have been established by the board. The rest of it could be determined based on, so that's the part that I think is essential. I don't know how other people feel.
That's fine. And the second part is actually captured in developing a proposal for a process.
Okay, so if we take off the second part, can I get a consensus? Okay. Ask staff to develop a proposal for process and a timeline for any changes of the boundary process. Do you guys have any questions about that? Is that?
No, I'm understanding the conversation, and really, even if we brought those the information around the prioritization, it's then how do we get there? How does the board finally get there to decide that we're going to prioritize these particular areas? So it's, I'm listening to the conversation, and I think we have it. So it's bring you some information first. Once we're bringing the information on what the prioritization could look like, and you give us that feedback, we then have to work you through a process to say, we then want you to develop a policy that identifies this as our number one factor, this as our second factor, and if there are more than two, we have a process for doing that versus just having a discussion about what's the most important thing.
Sorry, but I think beyond that, it's more, until we get to this new policy, what's happening next year, what's happening the year after that, and the year after that.
Right, are we gonna?
Practically speaking.
Are we
right?
gonna turn back on administrative boundaries to get people unstuck?
And as Dr. Ivy just said to me on the sideboard, it's short-term versus long-term.
Yes.
And that's a conversation that we haven't had in terms of, in the short term, what will we do while we're trying to figure out what this new policy looks like?
So does it maybe mean adding, including ongoing practices in the meantime? Is that really?
Well,
what
no,
you're
and I
trying-
think adding and long-term implications or practices until we get there, so.
Including short and long-term goals.
Short and long-term implications.
Thank you, that's
Yes,
the word.
including short and
implication.
long-term implications. Can we
And
add that?
phasing, right, that's.
Ms. Schultz?
Okay.
I think this also is where the issue I raised would go, whether there's a need for something we don't have now. And I guess it doesn't have to be included in that, but I would just,
I did have that on here as
as another next step?
I did.
Okay, all right.
I was going to get to it at the end. I was going to get through to what we had on the board. So can I get consensus on the ask staff to develop the proposal? Consensus, please? Yes. Okay. Look at what impact pre-K will be on each of our schools and individual boundaries. Okay. Okay, I'm not sure how that's not.
This is really not
included.
necessary for this as much as if we're looking at the CIP going forward, because we know that there are some proposals about universal pre-K floating around out there. And if we end up with universal pre-K, then all of our boundary discussions at the elementary school level will change anyway.
Okay. Consensus, please.
Said we can put it into the CIP.
You want to parking lot this? Okay, we're going to take that off and parking lot it. Ensure consistency across boundaries, is that?
ensure consistency of programming across pyramids. That's the issue of the middle schools, so that we don't have people diverting out of individual middle schools and then high schools.
Is that a part of the boundary process, though?
Yeah.
Okay. Ensure, do you want them to bring back information on what the program inconsistencies are across boundaries? I mean, I'm trying to figure out what's the action item out of this?
Well, actually, I think this ends up being part of our goal setting. And so I would just urge staff to look at that as part of the goal setting discussion.
So do you want them to bring information about the consistency of programming across pyramids?
or maybe
for the
consider
goal-setting
consistency.
conversation?
Consider consistency of programming.
Okay.
And I appreciate not just middle school, because I have elementary school.
Right,
pyramids.
across programs.
Right.
As we looked at that last bullet with pre-K, I think that there are a variety of programs that we should bring forward that you could consider as we think about boundaries. So we can make sure that we have that information added.
And then, Ms. Palchik, that last one, a task force?
No, I think this was just, thank you.
'Cause
We
I
just
think-
need a plan. I think we have one for now.
So the other next step that I had, that I share with Ms. Evans, is consider whether we need another type of boundary definition or change that is not met by the existing definitions. And I do think that that's an accurate reflection that we may potentially need.
Or I would say our process, boundary definition or process.
A boundary definition or process that is beyond those that are currently in
That's just
policy.
different, that isn't served by our current.
And so it's currently types of boundary adjustments on the matrix, and so we could talk about different types of boundary adjustments.
Okay, can I get a consensus on this one, please? Okay,
Ms. Schultz, I have a technical question.
okay.
And it might have to do with that, but it's my understanding that Virginia code, there's state codes that dictate how boundaries can be done in the Commonwealth. So I do think whether it's in that bullet point or somewhere, we need to make sure that staff has done that crosswalk and says, by code, we can do this, and then therefore, there might be more latitude to do additional types of boundary processes.
We could add a line with state codes to that last word, just say in a
Actually, to
line.
the schedule two additional work sessions, that's, including related state code issues. So, yeah. Okay, anything else? All right, folks, that's the end of this work session. We are now an inauspicious 43 minutes behind. We'll take a 2-minute break so we can change videos, and we're going to go right on into FCPS on.